Third mistake that a lot of anglers make when they're trying to fish a crankbait is that they're using the wrong speed of retrieve or the wrong retrieve in general. The most common way that guys throw a crankbait, whether it's a square bill or a deep diver, is they cast that bait out, they let it hit the water, and they just reel it in at a steady pace. They just kind of take an easy approach, just kind of reel it in. And while this can catch fish, it's usually the least effective strategy for catching fish when you're throwing a crankbait. Now, Randy has a lot of secret retrieves and cool stuff that he'll talk about here in a second. My way of fishing a crankbait is mainly focused on deeper diving crankbaits. I don't really fish that many shallow diving crankbaits anymore because I fish 90% of my time offshore. And what I find is that with a crankbait offshore, there's really only two retrieve speeds you need to have. The first is reeling it as fast as you possibly can reel it and just burning it back to the boat. This will cause that bait to deflect violently off cover and trigger a lot more reaction strikes. And I find that when I'm throwing a deep diving crankbait or any crankbait that dives deeper than about 7 or 8 feet deep, the faster you can reel that crankbait when the water temperature is above 50 degrees, the more bites you get. Now, once that water temperature hits below 50 degrees and gets like in that 45 degree range, I completely switch it up and go to a very slow retrieve. And basically what I do is reel 7 or 8 times to get that bait down to the bottom. Then I'll just reel that bait as slow as I possibly can to maintain bottom contact. So you're just barely cranking that reel handle, maybe speeding it up every once in a while to maintain bottom contact. And when those fish are super lethargic offshore in the wintertime, especially if you're fishing on steeper banks or like little offshore rocky spots off the bank, throwing a 8 to 12 foot diving crankbait like a rock crawler, a wiggle wart, something like that, and just crawling it across the bottom can generate a lot of good strikes. And so I find that if you're going to catch fish on crankbait, especially off the bank, either reeling it as fast as you possibly can when the water temperature is above 50 degrees is the best, or then when it's below 45 degrees, as slow as you can possibly reel it while maintaining contact with the bottom. Those are the two ways you do it. So, Randy, what are your thoughts there?
Well, shallow water fishing, the retrieves on it, there's a lot more diversity that you have to come up with. So I'm going to give away a big secret here. Again, I've given up so many secrets last couple of months here. But one of the things I want to do, first of all, before I give that secret away, let's talk a little bit about it. The retrieve that you want to use for shallow water is determined by water visibility and water clarity both, and the type of crankbait you're using, because some crankbaits, they basically fight you a lot more than other ones. Some of them, if you're throwing like a shad wrap crankbait, it pretty much comes through the water without much effort. But if you're throwing, like a wiggle wart or like a DD22 or something like that, it fights you all the way back to the boat. And your reaction of when you do like a stop and go retrieve, how that bait reacts to that stop and go retrieve has a lot to do with the bill angle of that bait. But basically what you want to remember in crankbait fishing, if I can tell you one tip before I get to the secret, is you got to use stop and go all the time. There's very few crankbaits that I ever fish that I just reel straight in. In fact, I don't think there's any of them on that. And a stop and go retrieve isn't like as simple as just cranking it a few times, stop and go. A lot of it has to do with how fast you're cranking prior to when you stop, and it has to do with how quick you start it up again. And this variation a lot of times is something you have to experiment with based upon the water clarity and the water temperature. For the most part, just the foundational aspect that's very common knowledge is that the colder and the dirtier the water is, the slower that you need to keep your retrieve, and vice versa. As the water visibility gets cleaner and warmer, that's when you need to speed it up a little bit. And there's a lot of variations between that, because when you're talking about cold water cranking, I don't really start doing much cranking until the water temperature starts to get in the upper 40s. But there's a big separation between the water temperature getting in the upper 40s to when it's 90 in the summertime of the year. And every time you've got like a 5-degree separation in that water temperature, that's can require a different rate of speed on your retrieve and your pauses and your stop and go retrieve. So that's a matter you just have to experiment. But basically, use that stop and go retrieve all the time. The big secret I want to tell you guys that will really help you as far as you retrieve on your crankbaits in shallow water is learn to pull your crankbait through the water. And what I'm talking about is when you cast it out there and you get that bait down to the sweet spot, to the maximum depth where it's starting to hit bottom. Try fishing your crankbait like you would like a football head jig. Crank it a little bit, stop it, and then don't reel and just pull. And as you take up the slack, don't keep the bait coming forward by speeding up your retrieve as you pull it and give it slack. So in other words, you're coming through the water, you're hitting the bottom, and you're pulling it like that without reeling, and then speed up like that to catch up with it again. The bait's still moving a little bit, but there's something about that pulling motion that you have without cranking the rod that basically it not only gives you better feel, but it gives the bait a little bit different action on there that you can't get from a normal straight stop and go retrieve. That's a big secret here in the Ozarks that a lot of people don't understand, especially in cold water cranking. Another thing like that I like to do as far as retrieve is when you're bouncing off objects. It doesn't matter if you bounce off rocks, wood, laydowns, whatever. When you come across an object and your bait's really fighting to get over that object, and you can feel it digging in or hitting a limb hard or something like that, as soon as you get free from that object where you don't feel it anymore, that's when you need to really smoke that bait for just maybe 2 or 3 cranks to the handle. Because a lot of times when you're hitting something real hard, you're getting the attention of the bass. The bass is looking at it. You got its attention. You got it interested. And when it gets free from whatever it's knocking off of and deflecting, and you speed that bait up real quick, a lot of times that'll generate the strike. But there's no book that you can read on say, hey, you need to throw your bait with this retrieve under these conditions, and it's going to work. Fishing doesn't work like that. It's a matter of experimentation. If something's working, stay with it. If it's not working, just try something different for 10 minutes, a different retrieve. So just keep an open mind, keep experimenting.
That's awesome stuff. And as you're talking about that, Randy, I feel like my earlier description wasn't nuanced enough, because that's exactly how I work my deep diving crankbaits, but not because I'm intentionally doing it. When I'm casting that bait and I'm burning it really fast, when I'm throwing my deep diving crankbaits, they're always digging the bottom. And so to keep the bait from getting unhung, or keep the bait from getting hung, I have to stop my retriever every once in a while to let that bait come over the top of the cover. And one way I do that is actually pulling the bait through brush piles, through rocks. And then as soon as I feel like it's free, I start burning it again really fast. And so, like you said, it's the exact retrieve you just mentioned. It's just I don't consciously think about it. I'm just basically, my thought process is reel that bait as fast as you can, and then when you feel like you're going to get hung, stop it, pull it through the cover, and then keep burning it. It's the exact retrieve you're using there. And then when I'm fishing it slow again, too, same thing. I'm doing a lot of pulling and stuff like that. So I think pulling a crankbait, like you mentioned, that's a golden tip. And I do it subconsciously because I fish crankbaits so much now I don't even think about it. But now that I really think about it, I probably get more bites while I'm pulling my crankbait or when I'm stopping and burning it than any other time. So awesome tip there.
Here's the one thing I'll leave you guys with cranking retrieves like that is when you're talking about retrieve variations, so much of that's one aspect of fishing that comes from experience. It comes from muscle memory. Yeah. When you start to hit cover with the crankbait, there's an intuitive part of your fishing being based upon experience that sort of intuitively and instinctually tells you if you need to speed up or slow down. It's hard to explain, but the more you fish, the more years you get under your belt as an angler, you'll know what I'm talking about, that mind muscle memory, aspect of crankbait fishing.
Yeah, it's definitely an art form to get those crankbaits through brush or through cover without getting hung up. And it takes time doing it, but it's definitely worth it once you get that right art of knowing when it's about to hang up, pulling it free, burning it, speeding it up. And one other thing I will say that I actually noticed recently in one of the recent videos I made, I'd never noticed I did it until I was trying to make a segment about my retrieve. When I'm fishing a crankbait over kind of more gravelly rock bottom where I'm not bumping into anything or really getting in some thick cover, especially on just flatter gravel banks, I actually reel my crankbait and I'll twitch my rod almost like I'm flaring a jerkbait. And while I'm reeling it, I just give it one big twitch and reel it and twitch it a couple times. And I've actually seen KVD do this when he was doing a chest cam video. They just showed him fishing a crankbait for 20 minutes, and he did this all the time, just fishing a straight bank. And I've done it for years watching now. I went back and watched 5 or 6 other clips from like the last 4 years, and I do it so much where I'm just reeling my crankbait in, and without even thinking about it, I just give it a twitch when I don't hit something for 5 or 10 seconds. I just literally pull the rod tip and kind of make that bait deflect or move when it's not hitting cover. So if you're not hitting anything for a while, jerk your rod tip a couple times to flare that bait. I think I've just got bit doing it so many times over the years. I literally never even think about it. I only notice it because I watch myself on camera doing it, and you have no idea how many times when I watch my fish catches from the past, right when I do that, I get bit. So those are little things that are a pretty big deal. Cool. So that is the third biggest mistake that new anglers for crankbaits, or a lot of anglers who throw crankbaits, make. They don't vary their retrieve enough. They don't pay attention to their speed of retrieve.